Looks like so. All right. So, hello, and really thank you, VJ, for hosting these. I know how hard virtual things can be in the last year, conferences and meetups and stuff like that. So, the effort to provide an avenue for these things is appreciated. Tonight, I am going to go into a couple of things about accessibility. It's going to be pretty high level, and I'll talk about some of my experience and kind of where that came from, and then go into a little bit of demonstration and example code for the skip link. So this is really more of an informal conversation. I found they tend to work nice with my team and groups at the company I work at. So a little bit about me. I've been a front-end UI developer in various code bases and frameworks and platforms for probably 15 plus years now, and made my way up through the web and got into Angular and some of those frameworks a few years ago, and that really led to my current role at VMware, which is working on their design system. And if you're not familiar with design systems, as a simple description, they are collections of tools that people can use to implement a web application, but there's usually a little bit more. There's tools for designing, there's tools for pulling components off the shelf and then gluing them together to make your application. So we provide this with the Clarity design system, and that's where I've spent most of my time the last 3-4 years. So Clarity offers Angular components, was the initial sell to developers, and we were able to kind of distribute those throughout VMware. This past year, or actually past year and a half, we spent a lot of time bringing things up to level with accessibility. The main thing we learned when we started focusing on accessibility is it's about removing barriers and clarifying the user interface for certain types of users. These are keyboard-only users and screen reader users. So if anyone has ever used a screen reader on some of the common websites, you may understand some of the differences in the interactions between a sighted mouse user versus a blind screen reader only user on a web page. And so as we kind of realized some of the mistakes we had made and went in to fix them, the power of our design system was nice because these were bugs throughout VMware's suite of applications. And when we addressed the ones that we could fix dozens or hundreds of bugs across the entire suite of applications that were able to adopt those changes. So really, accessibility is about scaling those changes across your portfolio. Let's go to, sorry, 1 minute. Let's go to the next slide. So at a high level, the work with accessibility is kind of almost extra work on top of your normal application development. So once you get something up and running and working and you have to make it accessible, there's usually a whole different set of considerations. So it takes some nuance and interpretation to get right. And there isn't really a prescribed way. A lot of the resources out there for accessibility focus on very simple demonstrations of techniques. One of the things that we learned really early on is that screen readers are very much like the pre-Evergreen browser days, where you have different screen readers that do different things with the same markup code. And so you have to work through that to figure out why you would do that. And the reason I say all this is to kind of sell the point of why folks should care about accessibility and why they should make that investment of time and resources to do it. There's really two reasons. The US is lagging a little bit behind some of the other places in the world, but there are legal reasons that could affect your ability to sell your software if it's not accessible. And there's also cases where if you're offering a certain type of web application or using it for a certain type of service, you have legal responsibilities that could get you into trouble if you don't service all those users. And then the second reason, which is really a little closer to what we care about on our team, is that we don't know who's going to be using VMware's products. So we want to make sure that however they're interacting with our tools, with our applications, that they're included and that it's easy and a good experience for them. Because accessibility is so huge, though, tonight I've just got a really short focus look into skip links. And I don't know how many folks are familiar with these. They're getting to be pretty common, especially since the US is requiring these on bigger and bigger sites. I actually was going to use Amazon.com as one of the examples, and then since I had last looked, they actually changed something and they actually include one. So I had to scramble earlier today and find a site that was complex enough that didn't have one. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But skip links are generally a form of navigation that's optimized for users who rely on screen readers or their keyboard only users. So the more complicated your app or the website, the more complex your navigation is going to be. And what I mean by that is that you could start out with a simple blog or a simple informational site with just links in a header and maybe a few links in a footer that take you to different pages. But as you branch out or you add complexity to your content or you create an application, you may have sidebars, you may have tabs, you may have sub-navs underneath your header with drop-down menus. And skip links gives you a sort of orthogonal mode of navigation to think about how to target these different areas and lead folks to them who are using their keyboard or their screen reader. So initially, I was going to talk about Amazon, but let's think about if you've ever been on Home Depot's website. I don't know how many folks are. I'm going to show it in a little bit. But there's a header with some links, and then there's some more subsections that have more links. And the screen reader works similar to the keyboard in the sense that there's a cursor. So the cursor being the thing that's focused, and a screen reader will just start reading through content, and the user can control this with the keyboard, arrows left, arrow right. There's certain things that they can do to interact with the content. A keyboard user will most likely tab through the focus to get to places that are interesting, and maybe because they can see they want to click something, so they'll click on it with the enter button. Maybe that opens a drop-down navigation menu, and maybe it expands or selects a tab depending on what's going on. But the point is, these folks aren't relying on sight to interact with the content. They're relying on a tool, the screen reader or the keyboard. So they have to navigate to actually interact with this content. And skip links really give you a way to think about how can I take them from the beginning of this DOM tree directly to certain types of navigation or to certain areas of content. One thing I will say, because I mentioned the legal stuff earlier, is that skip links aren't necessarily a requirement. They aren't legally required, but they're really nice to do. And they're encouraged, especially by the WCAG folks. They're basically a consortium of accessibility experts that set the standards and set the requirements for meeting certain aspects of those standards. So the theory about skip links, there's a couple things that you need to know about them. And the way I started with them is to really start small and then layer complexity on top. And I'll try to give a good view of how I thought about it, and if that works for you, then maybe there's a variation that will work for you there. But basically, there's about 5 things you need to do to have an effective skip link. Basically, first thing is that it's got to be at the body, or as I'll show, as close to the body as possible, so that it's really one of the first things that a screen reader or a keyboard user will interact with. The second thing is that you need to be able to create links to specific DOM elements. For me, I use the ID because it's one of the easiest ways to make sure I'm targeting specific places, and then using an href link that gives you in-page navigation. So that's the second key, is just understanding how to use the tools that are already there. And then the third part is kind of going to be a little bit of CSS, where you have to properly hide the skip link, because screen readers don't need to see it. They'll interact with it as long as it's properly in the DOM, and keyboard users only need to see it when they focus on it. So we'll get into that a little bit more. And that leads to the next point, which is you have to be able to add some sort of hide show behavior to your skip link so that it is triggered when focus enters it, and it's hidden when focus leaves the DOM element. And finally, one of the most important things that I learned about from the accessibility folks is really having a clear written description of what this thing does, because if you just say go, they don't know where they're going. And the screen reader, unless you are taking the time to put in all of the ARIA labeling and taking the time to do it that way, the screen reader won't know what else this thing is going to go to. It'll just read go. So saying go to content or go to search is very useful for the folks who don't see the content like I do as the creator of that content, as a developer who's takes for granted the site that I have. All right, so first demo is the bad demo, and let's go. Sorry, Zoom is I'm not a huge fan of their on-screen interface. All right, so the bad demo, Home Depot. To move some things around. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so we're on the page. Let me just reload to make sure everything is. And I'm gonna just show the screen reader. I wasn't sure how to actually hook up sound to make it work with the VoiceOver, which is the Macintosh or Apple's built-in screen reader software. But I'm gonna start hitting the tab button now. And do you notice up here for the Pro, there's a little colored brackets around there? Now it's back up to homedepot.com. So this is me as a keyboard only user. And I maybe want to click the shop now button, but if I'm a keyboard only user, I've got to go through everything that the header contains, and then the subheader now, subnav, whatever your term is for it. I've got to click through or tab through all of that content, and it turns out their slideshow is not even accessible because it must have gone right past it. But that's the point I'm trying to convey here, is that the keyboard only user may want to, the only thing they may want to do is click on sign up now, but because we don't have a way for them to quickly get there, they have to tab through everything, and that's not a great experience. So if we look at somebody who does it well, this is a very simple site. This is Starbucks, but they're actually really good with their accessibility. So if you're ever looking for simpler examples, they have a lot of good example in their source code. But if you notice, so I'm on the page, I reload, and first tab leads me right to this green button that slides in, says skip to main content. And so now when I tab, you notice the learn more button is now focused. So I can quickly hit enter as a keyboard user, and I go right to the content that I wanted to go to. So that's the point that I want to make with with good and bad demos, and then show this clarity demo that I'm gonna open up here. So this is our new clarity documentation site that I'm one of the main people working on. And we talked with the accessibility team inside VMware, and they really wanted us to do a little bit more than what Starbucks did, and definitely wanted us to do more than what Home Depot did. So when I go to the skip link, the first one is skip to main content. And there's different ways to do it, but the way we did it is to really focus on the container, because this site, we'll get into a little bit of the code in a bit, but this site is a statically generated site using ViewPress, which is built on top of the Vue framework. And so this content inside this bucket that's selected changes. And there's no way to know or guarantee, what the first button is. So going with some back and forth, this is what I mean about the nuanced application of accessibility. The folks who are the experts inside VMware said, well, we don't like it, but we're okay if you can just get to the content. So that's one thing they asked us to provide. So now I reloaded, and you'll notice the first one is skip to main content. The next thing they wanted is skip to navigation. What this one does is it bypasses anything else and takes the user right to the navigation menu that they can then start tabbing through and exploring the site, or going right where they know that they need to go if they want to go to one of these pages. And then the third place they asked us to put one to is to the search box. We are considering search as another form of navigation, and because it's useful especially for screen reader users to be able to get to the search as quickly as possible, it gives them a lot more tools to finding relevant content and getting to the places that they need to go. So that is the sort of high level demo. So next I'm gonna show a little bit of code and talk about it. And if you have questions, this is Vue code. It is specific to Vue, but I'm gonna try to go through. I realized when we first started talking, there's some folks who may not be familiar with Vue. So I will talk a little bit about some of the things specific to Vue, if you think it's worth it. But at a high level, we need a reusable template that we can instantiate with that descriptive text I was talking about. And we also need to pass in an ID for an element somewhere else on the page that we want to skip to, hence the term skip link. We need a way to add some style that will control the visibility and the position of this link, as well as the behavior. And then we also need to be able to tie into the 3 browser events for click, blur, and focus. So I'm going to switch over to my editor. All right, so this is the template for our Vue static site, our ViewPress static site. And this is actually a file called layout.vue. It does some other stuff, but the main point is that this template is a Vue template. However, inside it we have this main container, and this is really where everything in the site, the header, the side nav, the main content, anything that we want to show up at any given time, it will be in here when the site is rendered out with the tools that ViewPress provides. And what I want you to notice is that I have these 3 skip to components or elements on the page, and these are Vue components. And we have one that is looking for and going to a content area, one that is looking for and going to a side nav element, and one.
Matt, I'm sorry to cut you I'm not sure what I'm seeing right now. It's just the PowerPoint with skip to view. I'm not sure
This is now a code editor.
I don't see the code editor.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I? Yep. Sorry. I should have practiced more. Let me share that. Where is WebStorm? There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you for letting me know. Okay. So now, can you see the markup?
Yes. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry about that. So now I'll start back over. So now we have this container, and this is just a div container that contains everything in the site. At some point, depending on the stuff below, you'll get the header, you'll get the side nav, you'll get the content container. And what I was just talking about is there's a view component that I made called skip2. And this component has two properties that it takes. One is the toID that we want to skip to. So in this case, it's going to find the element with an ID of content area. And it's going to create a button that has skip to main content as the text. Same thing with the second one, except that it's going to look for the side nav. And this third one is going to look for the Algolia search input. And so that is really the instantiation of this component. And now we'll actually take a look at the high level of this component. So if you're not familiar with the view, it's the way I've been interacting with it for the most part. It consists of a view component. In this case, the skip2 component consists of a template, a script that hosts all the behavior we want to apply or deal with in the component, and then certain styles that we want to apply to the elements in the component. So you can target them, you can target different languages, you can actually scope them if you're familiar with what that is and what that's for. And when ViewPress renders the site out, it actually renders this, renders this view component out and makes it available in our HTML like you saw before. So let's look at this template. It's pretty simple. Skip links themselves are pretty simple, but I think they're a pretty powerful tool to demonstrate some of the benefits of spending the time on accessibility. One other thing to note is that I am using one of the core components from Clarity Design System. As I mentioned earlier, we started with Angular components, and we quickly, sorry, this is a sidebar. We quickly ran into an issue inside the company is that not everybody uses Angular. There is a myriad of other frameworks in use, but they all wanted or needed to use the look and feel of Clarity. So about a year plus a few months ago, we started an initiative to create our components in a design agnostic way. And that really means doing them with web components. And we'll talk a little bit about some ideas for the skip link at the end of this. But that's what this is. This is a web component that Clarity ships called CDS button. It's basically a button, but I can pass in some attributes. So I want my button to be the danger button that Clarity provides. I want it to be small. And then for this component, I'm actually going to give it a special class called docSkipLink. And that is the style. This really controls the position of the component itself. So it's going to position it absolutely in the browser, kind of a little offset from the top and the left, and make it visible to the user because we're using the danger one. This next line, if you know anything about frameworks, Vue gives you the ability to bind properties to these attributes. So this colon is Vue's way of saying, I want to bind something to the class of this element. And so the way this reads is it's passed in an object that has some text. This text is conditionally displayed based on the value of hide skip link. Additionally, you'll notice this at focus and at blur for now. This is Vue's way of saying listen to the focus event or listen to the blur event. And when you hear the focus event, set hide skip link to false. When you hear the blur event, set hide skip link to true. So what that does is when this is true, clear screen reader only class is applied to our button. When it's false, clear screen reader only class is not applied to our button. And I will show what that looks like in the browser because I don't have the code. We actually, that is a class that Clarity provides for making screen reader only text. So let's flip back over to Chrome. Where are we at? So if we take a look at the styles on this button, let me bump that up a little. All right, so here is my button, and you'll notice this clear screen reader only text. This is basically a very straightforward way to keep an element in the DOM and make it completely invisible. And this is what we need to do for screen readers. Screen readers can see this. They don't have any concept that it's visible or not visible on screen. So when a screen reader, when the screen reader cursor encounters this element, it just reads it like it's a normal part of the DOM and a normal part of the flow. And so Clarity ships this clear screen reader class only as a convenience class that folks can use if they need to. And it really just does a couple things where it clips things and makes it really small and makes it go away. When we remove this class, it's a normal button. So if I go in here, there we go. So if we take that class off, it should appear when I save. So now you'll see this button is there, and the second class, the doc skip link, is positioning it right where I want it to go. So that's the style aspect of this. Let's go back over to WebStorm. Now, the JavaScript part is the exported default for Vue itself. So this is a Vue component, as I said. We give it a name, skip2, and that's how you instantiate it as an element in your template. We default the hide skip link to a value of true, and then we have a couple things. Let's talk about props first. As I showed in the template above, for the layout where we're instantiating these, we give that skip2 element a label attribute and then pass in a value. We can type the value, and we can also set a default if we want to. Same thing with the toID. This is a string, and we can default to something, or we can pass a specific value in and make it a little more generic. The last thing to look at is, remember this click. Screen readers do click, not in the same sense as you do with a mouse click. It's more kind of like an enter, like you do as a keyboard user. But when you click that, we run this function, which does a couple little things. It calls this .skipTarget.focus, and that's a little confusing at first until I tell you that Vue has this idea of computed properties. And it's at a high level, it basically is something that it says, I will figure it out as soon as I can. And if I need to, if something changes, I'll figure it out again. But basically, computed means if I use this as a value somewhere, I can get the return of this function. And so this toID is the other property that we pass in, which is a string for the element we want to skip our focus to. So we use a simple browser API, document.getElement by ID, and then whatever string is passed in or the default is used. And so when we run that function on click, we can basically call the focus method of the element that's returned. and that's it for the view part. Let's go back. I think I've got one more slide. Yeah, so that's really all I had to talk about tonight. As I said, personally, I've found shorter talks at work do a little better. So that's kind of why I didn't go deep into code. If you guys want to talk more about code, I'm happy to. The last thing I want to leave with is that there's a couple of takeaways that I hope you remember. So accessibility is kind of hard, and it's almost double the amount of work just to get the app or the site up and running. But it is worth the notice, and you probably won't get sued by doing the extra work, which is probably a good thing, especially depending on your business. Skip links themselves really add another layer or nuance to your navigation, and they can give you a way to think, apply some design thinking to the structure of your application or your website. And as things get more complicated, you may need or want to just provide convenience methods to get to specific areas. If content is really, really long, having the ability to jump to certain sections that are common is useful. And skip links kind of gives you a great tool that you can use to provide that. And that's on top of the usefulness for screen reader users and keyboard only users. Finally, skip links are pretty simple themselves. Depending on the framework you're using, there's different syntaxes for creating them, but it can be a pretty small component. And the nice thing about thinking of it as a component is that you can reuse this throughout your app. You don't have to have a one-off area or a one-off page that has this functionality on it. You now have a little tool that you can use. The last thing I will say is that I had something in the works and I accidentally deleted my folder and it wasn't quite ready anyways. And I did not push it up to GitHub. So I lost an implementation I wanted to show where you could take the skip2 component I made in Vue and take it one step further. And this is actually something I will end up doing at work for VMware, is that we could make this a web component. And that means it's not tied to Vue any longer. It means anyone who wants this, no matter what framework they're using, they could implement skip links in their templates and get that reusability as well as consistency across products or applications that are really big. And so finally, I think building, the main takeaway from a design system perspective is that building reusable components helps you deal with problems like accessibility at a wide scale and deal with those problems, in a single way. So that is all I have, EJ. I apologize, it's not quite as long as I had hoped, but I lost my other content, so shame on me.
That's okay. At this point, I wanted to ask if there were any questions with anything seen so far shown. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hey, thank you, Matt. Curious to know, as you, in terms of developing content like that, how you test it. And are there accessibility testing tools that you relied on that you could recommend?
Yes.
And I just wonder how that compares to, what you showed us, which is you, a sighted user, tabbing on your keyboard, but I don't know how accurate that is for someone who's not sighted,
Right. So the way I test this actually is to just use the screen reader. So VoiceOver. So as I said earlier, screen readers are kind of a wild, wild west pre-evergreen browser days. So there's multiple screen readers for Windows. There's multiple screen readers for Mac. They behave differently with the same markup. If you've done web development long enough, that may sound familiar to Internet Explorer days versus Firefox versus whatever.
Oh, I remember Netscape 4 versus Net.
Uh-oh.
Stab my eyes out.
Right. So what we did is we made basically a decision to support two combinations for VMware products and Clarity itself. So we support Safari and VoiceOver on the Mac, and we support NVDA on the Windows platform in Firefox. What that helps us do is folks will encounter other issues, and when we find the ones where we've solved it one way in Firefox but it breaks in the other one, we basically have to say we would love to fix this, but if we fix this, this will break Firefox. Firefox is our supported browser on Windows for screen readers. So it helps us sort of limit the whack-a-mole that comes up with trying to please all of the different browser implementations. So that's one way is I will manually test this. There are automated tools, and there's actually an accessibility team now that is probably 20, 30 people inside VMware. They've grown in the last 2 years because it's so important for our business. And what they've said is that the automated tools catch the low-hanging fruit. They catch about 70% of the stuff. So you can hook them into your build process to hit pages, and it will spit out, oh, there's an error here, there's a warning here, similar to Jasmine or Karma, not Jasmine, Karma, some of the other typical testing frameworks that folks use. But they said that last 30% really is someone who's an accessibility expert going into the content and actually testing it. The final thing I'll say on testing is that you called me out on it, and it's a great thing. I don't have any tests in my website. Like Clarity itself, we're up to, I don't know, 6, 7, 8,000 tests. If I was gonna when I actually build a skip2 component, as I think we're gonna do some patterns that are a little more abstract than the atomic nature of components. So skip2 would be like a pattern. This is a pattern somebody would use. It's not a component. It's not a tiny little thing. It's kind of got its own level of sophistication. Like a header, for a corporate header would be something that we would do as a pattern. So when I ship that as a public entity and we publish it to NPM, it will have a suite of tests where I'll actually instantiate it somewhere and then test, does it have these characteristics? And I test it the same way I would with Jasmine, where it's like, navigate to this page and you should have an element here. It should not have this class. It should have this class, depending on the states that I pass into it. It should respond to a click. And when I click on something, it should move the focus somewhere. Those are things you can test in code pretty, in a standard way. So yes, it should have a test, but I'm a little behind on my website work, so I don't have any tests for it.
That was a great question.
No, just quick follow up though, because you did drop names of existing test runners that I've heard of. Is there any new test runner that you've come across that you'd like to tout? Anything that's accessibility oriented?
We use Jasmine for the most part.
Okay.
The React folks are big on, I can't think of the
framework.
name.
I think it's called testing framework.
Is that the name? There's a couple.
Yeah.
They're commonly to me.
Sorry, Kevin, you broke up for me a little bit. I don't know how good my internet connection is right now.
It's me. It's Spectrum. It's not me. It's
okay.
But what I'm hearing is that you're using commonly known testing tools.
Yeah, we don't look for anything obscure, but generally we started with Jasmine because that's what Angular CLI tools basically dumps you out with. And when way back in 2016, we bootstrapped the library with the CLI, and it was just why go through the pain of hooking something else up?
Cool.
So we stuck with it. It's served us well. There are other good ones out there though, so they have different contexts for the usage of them.
Great, thank you.
All right, cool. Anybody else with questions?
I just wanted to add that there is a website, WebAM, I think, WebAM, that publishes like which screen reader is the most popular and which is more, they send out survey of to folks, and then whenever whichever screen reader is popular, with what browser they publish it. And usually when we're testing, we need to keep in mind that VoiceOver is meant to support Safari. So like sometimes there will be problems with Chrome, and we're like, did you use Chrome? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, no, use it with Safari because that's what they are compatible with. And also there is a support of HTML5 and ARIA rules. So that's how like one behavior, you fix it for one browser, but it doesn't work in another browser because they don't support the same HTML5 and ARIA rules. So if you like look into WebAM website too, like they show like which ARIA role is supported by which browsers. So that's pretty helpful while fixing bugs, because you'll fix it for one thing and it breaks an iPhone and stuff like that.
Yeah. The Mozilla docs are pretty good in their accessibility section. They have a lot of examples for simple things. What-wg, I think, .org has examples. And one of the things we ran into is that those examples are very simple. So they have a simple, this is in a perfect world, here's how you would do a modal, and here's the ARIA roles that you would give it and whatnot. But we deal with complex applications, we deal with frameworks, we deal with things that are chunked up into templates and different files and don't always know about each other. And now you have to start to keep some of this, what is the ID and what is the correct ARIA value to point to that ID when you're dealing with things like drop downs and with modals, and those are the two that come to the top of my head. So that's why I want to reiterate my point of start small, solve the problem small, and then you can start to break it up and figure out how much more advanced you need to be when you're solving these things.
And there is a free AXA extension. So if you run that, if you just download it, you can download it from Web Store. It kind of flags if you have ID, like wrong ID or duplicate IDs.
That's one of the ones the folks inside VMware talk about, where they say it's great for probably the low-hanging fruit in that bottom 70%. It's also it's also one of the ones that if you're into generating and building your software, you can actually tie it into your continuous integration and have it run on the output after you've generated your website or your web application. So you can actually integrate that into your CI/CD process.
Luna, do you have the links? Can you share that with us in the chat? That would be great.
I'll do it now.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
May I?
Sure.
Yeah, I just started working as a web development recently, and the question I have is something about on blur and on focus. It's something that when I work on React and I use the accessibility, I think third party that helped me checking if the element that I'm working on is comply. And sometimes it just give me suggestion that if I have a function on click, I have to add on blur, but I don't know if I have to add also on focus. It's like, what is kind of like different of these two? I don't know if it's more like accessibility than your specific skip to.
Okay, so yeah, I probably could have been a little more clear about that. So and I can show the code again if it helps, but the focus event fires when a keyboard user tabs, when a keyboard user presses tab, what the website or the web application does, or what the browser does actually, is it moves focus from one element to the next element in the DOM hierarchy. And when it moves to that next element, an event is fired. It's called the focus event. So I can tie into that to flip the value of my Boolean and remove the class that's that screen reader only class that's hiding that button. When I tab to the next one, the blur event is fired, and I can tie into it to flip that value back and add my screen reader only class to that element, and it hides that one. And in the Clarity documentation example I showed, you notice how there's 3 buttons kind of stacked right on top of each other that as I tabbed through them, you saw the skip to content, skip to navigation, skip to search. Basically, they're all in the same place, but they're shown only when the screen reader only class is removed. And those 2 events are what it is. So those 2 events, basically every element has them. I think so. So when you tab or you click something, you will activate the focus event. And if you need to do some JavaScript stuff, you can tie into that if you know how to listen to it. Frameworks like React give you a way in your template to say, listen for the focus event, and then you can write the code somewhere else in the file to deal with it. Same thing with the focus, which is just the opposite event, really, or blur, sorry, opposite event where it's leaving the element.
I see. Thank you.
Is it the case though that in React everything has an on-click event, but on blur and on focus are not supported in the same way throughout React?
I'm sorry. I know
Yeah.
I know enough about React to know that we support it in a certain way with our web components, but I don't write a whole lot of React myself.
Those are great questions. I think like the last time I looked at the docs, I think they do support most of the cross-browser events. Let me see if I can get the documentation for it from the React docs. But yeah, I think you should be okay.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question about Clarity in general.
Sure.
Size with various projects, you know, it's obvious how it's going to be useful across. But I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about how random people around the world might use it and how it may get chosen between Material UI or Atlas Kit or anything else that's out there, you know.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of variety and a lot of options. I would draw a line between component-only libraries and design frameworks. So what we've tried to do with Clarity and what IBM has done with theirs, there's a couple others out there that are more design systems. And that's what we're trying to offer these guidelines. So we have specific use cases for VMware that we've used to vet our components and vet our stuff. And for the most part, these things have been researched somewhere by us, and we try to document that on our website. And that's what I mean by the usage guidelines, so that someone who's newer or new to the system even will say, what is an alert? What are the use cases for, like, how would I even know when to use an alert? And then the other thing we try to add is, where possible, what are the corner cases where what we say may not be the mainstream or may not be the only way to deal with the problem that an alert solves, so that folks who want to abuse, from our view, they want to abuse the alerts for something we're not intending it for, they still kind of understand our perspective, and that's where some of the limitations of the implementation that we provide happens. So I'll draw a distinction between design system, because we provide these kind of guidelines and this insight into how we think about the things that we provide. We also provide the design resources. We used to do Sketch, but the company moved to Figma, which is if you're familiar with that, cool. If not, think Photoshop, but for web design, application design, it's all SVG only, infinitely scalable canvases. And what we do is we provide these starter files where designers can basically link. I'm not a Figma expert, so I don't know the terms correctly, but basically, if they start a design and it knows about this Figma file that we ship with a library of our light and dark components, the designer can copy paste our components into a new page that they're designing, and it just works as desired. So they can get that in the design tool, they get that pixel perfect rendering of the thing they want the developer to build. Now the key here is that the values and the sizing and the paddings and the borders in the Figma file are or should be analogous to what a developer gets when they use those components in their HTML. So the value there is that you get that picture perfect image in Figma, and then the designer says, I want this, and I want it to look like that. The developer says, okay, well, I just need this component, and I need to add some tokens, and I need to make a little bit of stuff, but for the most part, out of the box, it works. So that's the distinction I'll draw between a system versus a component library. And I think Angular Material, Angular React, those I would consider libraries, but the material design spec, that is Google's system, right? The Angular Material or Angular React components are just the component level stuff, but somewhere else, it's not quite organized the way that we do it, but they did it, different way, and it's really, really well done. So they can offer that sort of, here's what a thing is, here's how to use it, here's some, use cases and corner cases, and then, in the documentation, they give you basically the API surface of the behavior. Here's the things you can customize, or that we want you to customize, or we want to make it easy for you to customize. We offer that. So that's kind of my high level talk on design systems. A little bit of history with clarity is we started, as I said, with Angular components. And the main reason was they would have actually started with React because that was a little more popular in VMware at the time. However, the legal team at VMware said, nope, everyone's got to stop using React. And so teams were phasing React out in 2014, 2015, because VMware compiles and ships software to customers, and the license with React pre-2017 or whatever basically said that if we shipped React with some of our products, that means Facebook has the right, not that they would do that, but they have the right to to see our proprietary source code for our products and other things like that. So when that changed, teams started using React, and that's when we had the push to, when is Clarity React coming? You already do Clarity Angular, and we've had 5-6 full-time engineers working on the Angular stuff for a while till we got it to a mature point where we were offering things like a data grid and a wizard and more complicated components, and we didn't have the bandwidth. So that's when we had serious conversations for how do we make a design agnostic framework. And the answer really is the web component spec, which is supported by 4 major browsers. If you're interested, I can post a link to learn more about the web component initiative. This is a great site to get started. But basically, the web component is 4 competing specs. There's the Shadow DOM. There's a couple of different specs inside there that sort of under this umbrella of something called a web component. But what it means is you can create these things that browsers support. You register them as native elements, and then your consumers can use them in a framework, with no framework, as they see fit. The one catch is React. React is a special child when it comes to web components because of the virtual DOM that they use. They are working on it, and I think they'll have something eventually. But right now we have to do kind of a special wrapper around our web component for the React folks to be able to use it. But everybody else, Vue, Angular, Svelte, if you're into that kind of thing, they can just take a web component and run with it. And we try to keep our API pretty simple and pretty consistent with the HTML spec, which is attributes and passing values in through the attribute model.
Okay. And VMware sells all sorts of software, but Clarity is free and open source.
Clarity is free, open source. Clarity.design is the main site. Look for a flip over to the site I showed you today in the next couple weeks, hopefully a week or two. It's MIT license if you care about licensing, which is probably one of the more permissive licenses, which means you get what you get, you don't throw a fit, but we don't care what you do with it either. So do what you want.
Right. Cool.
Excellent. Yeah, and I shared a link that I looked up just now about the Facebook patent.
They switched to MIT, I think, in 2017, so it's no longer a problem. But at the time, we were building out our components and our functionality. The legal team said you can't ever do a React version of this because no one can use it, and they were basically had put a ban on developing greenfield applications with React. Companies that had been acquired were required to start moving away from React so that they didn't have to ship. And then 2017, Facebook graciously changed their license and made a lot of folks' life easier.
Yeah. That's what this article is also saying too. But I wasn't familiar with that before, that they had that particular, thing in the license. What I wanted to ask you about too is, do you ever, as you have to like shuffle around with different things and adding the layer of accessibility to like what you do you feel like, you spend a lot in coding?
Sorry, say that again. I missed the last half.
Oh, so the last part was, do you spend a lot of time configuring, or do you spend more time coding because you're using these tools? So like configure means like, you're trying to get the tool to work so you can program, or do you feel like, you're doing more coding itself because the tool is easy?
I tend to do more coding. It's implementing the markup and basically adding the accessibility layer on or to it is dealing with the specifications for the thing you're dealing with. So if it's a popover, there's certain roles and ARIA attributes that help you handle the state of the popover or the pop-up, and how you manage that. If you're working inside a framework, sometimes you need to have some sort of service that can pass state between two different things, and so you get into a lot of that. The one thing I'll say that we did wrong with our first version of library is we were all pretty experienced developers, but not super experienced with accessibility. So like I knew ARIA and I knew what it was and kind of how to use some of it. I knew what roles were and that they needed to be added sometimes. And I did it when I knew, it was needed. But we didn't start with accessibility first in mind. And as the accessibility team grew out, one of the things we started to do is vet our proof of concepts with them first, because changing things after you shipped a component to NPM is hard because you can't muck with your API at that point. People are depending on this thing, unless you're doing a major version, which we only do 2 a year, and we really don't like to break things. We found that getting the accessibility folks involved or dealing with it as we're doing the other work is actually a lot more beneficial. It takes a little more time and a little more work on the dev part, but it saves us from having to try to unwind things after we've shipped something publicly and then fix the accessibility bug that it's triggering in a product.
Right. Okay. No, No, I was just curious. Sometimes, when adding a lot of when I was looking at your view code, right, I happened to see, you had all these different JS config, JSONs, and I was just thinking, like, it looks a little bit more complex than
View,
what I
yeah,
usually see.
ViewPress is not your typical thing, and in the Clarity repository is a mono repo. So we actually have our Angular components in there. We have our web components. We actually ship a legacy that we don't talk about very much anymore, CSS, HTML only style sheets that get extracted and built as part of our build process. We have a bunch of applications besides the website that are used to demonstrate how to use or test certain things in AngularJS, for example, or Vue or React, or different use cases that we're trying to make sure we're not going to break something when we build it. So that repo is very complicated. ViewPress itself is an interesting animal, I will say, having worked with it now long enough. But it's different from what I'm experienced with. If it was a Vue project, it would be
Right.
the Vue stuff. If it was an Angular project, I'm familiar with the Angular setup, and that's maybe what you're referring to with the configuration.
Yeah.
And the command line tools will generate most of that stuff for you with those. ViewPress is a little bit different, but it is a fast static site renderer, so there's trade-offs there.
Gotcha. I myself am not that familiar with Vue, so I would need to go and take a look at that. I get it on the surface level, but I think when I was seeing you add in a whole bunch of JSON configs, I was thinking, okay, this looks a little bit more.
I was in presentation mode. So you saw my file navigator?
No, just the files that you were showing from before.
Oh, okay. So the first one being the skip to component, and the second one being the layout.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a Vue specific or ViewPress specific thing. So we actually built a custom theme for our documentation website, but you can actually use ViewPress the same way you do a WordPress site, except that it's all statically. You can say, I want to install this theme and not have to deal with any of that layout stuff and whatnot.
Okay.
I just want to do content and write all my content in Markdown. Yeah, you can just, there's on there ViewPress documentation, you just add a theme, configure it in the config, and then away you go, just write Markdown. We have a little bit more advanced stuff that we want to do with it. So
are you gonna share any Git repos with us so we can take a look, or are you able to share?
That's what I was saying. I had a in progress web component standalone. This is a skip to web component, and I was cleaning up after Christmas, and I hadn't pushed my changes to GitHub, so I deleted all my stuff when I was cleaning up some stuff.
I see.
But if you're, I guess if you ask a specific thing, I can point you to some places in the Clarity repository for specific.
Yeah. Even that would be great. Maybe there are projects you looked at that you liked, you could point us
to. Sure. Well,
yeah.
I'm. So that's a kind of a general question. Is there something specific that you're looking for with the web components, the ViewPress?
So just to be more specific, basically, for this talk, you may have referenced some accessibility.
Okay, I did post the WG and the Mozilla accessibility site link above.
Yeah. Okay. So the what?
So those are two sites I'll go to when I'm having questions about accessibility. I'll start there to educate myself before I kick off a discussion with somebody on the accessibility team. But generally, my MO is to identify the issue I'm trying to solve, which could be you don't have the right role for the issue reported would be you have the wrong role for your popover, and I'll educate myself on what roles are available, because as I said, we've learned in a complicated world, it's not always the ideal world doesn't always match up with the real world. And so before I take it to them and say, I can't give this element a popover role, I need to know what's available, and we work together to come up with a solution. So that's my thing, is that I'll educate myself with the Google stuff, what with WG or Mozilla.
Okay. So
Then
what WG and then the Mozilla developer.mozilla.org/NUS docs web accessibility, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff there.
Okay. And then for ViewPress, would it just be the main ViewPress site?
Yeah.
Is there?
I can look. They have a doc site.
Okay. I'm just going to share these. The reason I'm asking is because I just wanted to get them in the chat once more.
Got it. Sorry. Yeah, I didn't prepare all that stuff. Sorry.
That's okay. No problem. All right.
Matt, it kind of sounded like you were asking the question, what would WG do?
I get it.
Corny
right.
joke.
Any other questions? Is everybody pretty good on web accessibility? I think this was a pretty good, talk and intro to kind of some of the things, especially if you want to take a look at some of these resources a little bit more. Like Matt is saying, I think web accessibility. Oh, and that was a question I also had in the back of my head. Before I kind of go off that, why does VMware in particular, care so much about accessibility? What is their big thing besides, just the lawsuit part? Like, what else is there a customer using web accessibility?
Right. So I'm in the design group inside VMware, and we care a lot about a couple things: CX, DX, customer experience, developer experience. And what we found is doing things to make it accessible to screen readers and for keyboard only users generally is also good for people who are normal users with their keyboard and their mouse or their trackpad. The skip links is a great example, because once you learn about them, you start to check all the sites you go to. Because I prefer to keep my hands on the keyboard more often than not, as much as possible. So now that I know that they're there, the first thing I'll do when a site loads is tab. Do I have skip links? Can I just go right somewhere else and continue tabbing to get, activate links, some of those calls to actions, etc. So there's that. But for VMware, a big part of the investment in it is the legal, and there's two aspects to the legal. I will say the way that you insulate yourself from the legal aspect is there's a whole industry out there, and there's a couple main companies that do this thing called Vpats. So you pay them huge sums of money and you say, here's our website or here's our application, and they will actually go through the accessibility criteria, the documentation that says, here's the spec for when you have a modal, what a sighted user should have, what a keyboard user should have, and what a screen reader should have. And they will flag deficiencies for you, and you can document them. And as long as you've done that, you sort of insulate yourself to a certain extent from some of the lawsuits, because you know about them, and if you know about them, the idea is you're actively trying to fix them. And with VMware, the legal stuff is that the US kind of lagged behind Europe and some other parts of the country. I'm not sure about APAC, but in the last 2 years, the US has kind of clamped down. Before, it was like, we have these rules, and if you want to sell to the government, or if you want to sell to people who get grants from the government, your software should be accessibility. It must be accessibility, but it was more of it has to be wink, wink kind of thing. And about 2.5 years ago, it was, there's no more winks. It's like, no, you can't sell to people we give grant money to. You can't sell directly to the government. And at VMware's level and companies at that level. This is hundreds of billions of, or this is billions of dollars, or millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's a worthwhile investment from a business sense.
Makes sense. Yeah. Awesome.
I wanted to add to that a little bit. So Section 508 says that every software the government uses, or anybody who's going to in a business with government, needs to be accessible. So it's not like just accessible like a website, but like everything needs to be accessible. But then it also applies to software. So for government and then any company, so if you look at the Social Security website and everything, they're very accessible compared to like new websites or modern websites. And but then what happened is, this is only like talking about government softwares or government uh, related stuff, but now there's not particular saying that it needs to apply for other companies. But recently Domino's got sued, and it so Domino's said that you can just call and make a order pizza, but then our website does not need to be compliant. But actually the court favored the person who sued Domino's, so that's like kind of like, hey, it's not written, but like definitely court will support um, the other person like who's filed accessibility claim. So it's like kind of like, hey, you need to be compliant. And so to be compliant with Section 508, WCAG Act 2.0 by W3C, if you follow that, you are actually, Section 508 is also included in that. Like all the things that Section 508 talks about, like you are kind of compliant to Section 508. So you're kind of also preventing from, getting sued.
That's excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah. Well, these are great comments and great, feedback to this presentation. I think this is going to help a lot of people, trying to get their feet wet, as well as people who are a little bit more seasoned. What I wanted to invite other people on this meetup to do was, if anybody here is really, dialed in to this kind of stuff, if you are interested in furthering this talk, that would be really great. Luna, seems like you're pretty knowledgeable. So if you are interested in having, a follow-up with this, that would be pretty great too. And I can talk to you separately about that as well.
And just to mention, I'm just accessibility QA, so that's why I like testing and all those information. So I could definitely demo like tools or screen readers.
That's perfect. Thank you for that. Yeah. All right. Does anybody else have any more questions, or should we call it a night? Okay. Well,
let's call it.
Yeah, let's call it. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate every time people who show up and join the group for these meetups. If there are things that you would like us to take a look at for next time, be sure to reach out to me. There is a Discord channel. I'm not sure if everybody is aware of that, but Discord and Slack are two ways we primarily continue conversations after every meetup. So I'm going to share those links in the chat right now. If you want to join us on Discord and Slack, do so. And then basically,
are you split?
I'm sorry, could you say it one more time?
I was just wondering if the group is split between Discord and Slack arbitrarily, or?
Yeah, so when we started off with basically Slack, and then somewhere along the lines, our group got kind of big, and so then people from Slack, I guess, asked us if we wanted to go to the next level, pay up. So we decided to just jump to Discord, and so then Discord became our thing, and over time we've been just using Discord more so than Slack. So Discord is actually pretty full-featured. You can use screen sharing software inside there. It is a little bit like Zoom in itself. So it's kind of fun. And then also if you are into music or games and stuff like that. It's pretty fun. So I invite everybody to check out Discord. And then Slack, we always have Slack open anyway. So Slack is just, let me see if I have the invite link as well. So Slack is right here. I just shared the Discord and the Slack links. And I'm going to put them also in the descriptions for this particular video. I think one person asked, where do we go to find the videos afterwards? Videos are always posted to youtube.com/hackbuddyorg, and I'll put a link to that as well. So yeah, thank you everybody. And thank you, Matt, for this presentation. Matt, is there anything you would like to add or just tell us about in general with what you are doing so lately?
Nothing specific. We are revamping the documentation for our upcoming V5 release next week. If you're interested in web components, it's one of the things that I'm starting to think it is the future of component libraries, because it's a lot easier to develop one component that works everywhere versus components for framework 1, framework 2, whatever framework comes along tomorrow. So if you're interested in sort of the cutting edge, that I posted the link in the chat, but it is a great resource for kind of learning about it. This Open Web Components site is a really, openwc.org is a really good site to kind of see what the pieces are and understand how they're put together.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would be a great follow-up. If you want to give a talk at some point about that, that would be awesome. Just let me know.
Yeah, I can actually go back and re-implement my thing and maybe walk folks through how to implement the skip2 as a web component, which is what I wanted to show at the end, but I cleaned house on. So
yeah. This is pretty cool. I actually want to explore this myself today, and so I probably will do that after this meetup. Cool. Web components and WebAssembly, right? Like they're two different things, right?
Just very different. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. So WebAssembly is more just kind of like small binary files for software that you just drop in with JavaScript, whereas components is just basically like rewriting a lot of these React or Vue components.
Right. WebAssembly is, you can compile C software and it'll run in a browser. You can compile, you can write Rust, it'll run in a browser. And the WASM, WASM is the extension of the binary that's compiled, and the benefits there for WebAssembly. I'm only telling you, I took a high-level 101 course recently just to sort of educate myself. But basically, the difference is that with JavaScript in the browser, you have that runtime, and it has to interpret the code before it can actually, execute the functions that are available. The WASM, the WebAssembly virtual machine is what it is a virtual machine in the browser that takes that binary. There's no compilation, there's no interpretation. It's just, there's a function, you call the function, and it does what it does. So there's a lot of power there, but it's also pretty new, pretty obscure. So it's not at all related to web components.
Gotcha. And that sounds just as exciting. I mean, when you brought up Figma, that made me think about that again, because Figma,
I believe, yeah, if you've used Figma in the browser, I believe some or all of their application is actually a WebAssembly binary running in the browser.
That's awesome. All right. So I guess we can end there on an interesting note with WebAssembly and web components. And if anybody wants to reach out afterwards, feel free to, either on Discord and Slack, and I'd love to talk to you there. But otherwise, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you at the next meetup.
Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great night. Bye.